So first things first, we need to put on some very attractive bunny rabbit ears. Using a light pink colour on a sponge, I very lightly applied some blush to the cheeks. Using white, I outlined the area between my nose and my top lip to create the bunny's muzzle, and then I used a sponge just to fill this in. I went slightly overboard with the size of this shape and it was far too big, so I just took a baby wipe and ran my finger around the edges to make it the perfect size. And then I went back in with my brush and made the edges nice and neat again. I painted a white arch extending slightly higher than my eyebrow, and then I filled it in, taking it down to the crease. And then I took some dark pink on a sponge and I filled in my eyelid area and then blended the colour up into the white. I painted in the bunny's teeth on my bottom lip, and instead of making them a perfect rectangle, I tapered in the bottom edge to give it a bit more interest. Next, I added a cute pink nose in the same shade that I'd used on the eyelids. At this point, I thought the design looked a bit simple and a little bit boring, so to give it a bit more of a kick, I went in with a stencil and I added some pink stars around the muzzle. I faded them in from a darker pink on the outside edge to a very pale pink in the middle. And then, because I liked this effect so much, I did the same thing on the eyelids. I added a small amount of black eyeliner to define the eyes a bit more, and then I flicked it out a couple of times on the outside corners. For his mouth, I connected my nose down to my top lip with a straight line, and then I rounded out the bottom edges, and I also added a few flicks to the outside corners of my mouth to make him look more happy and smiley. I also added a few little whisker dots each side, and then I painted a black line down the centre of his teeth to separate them, but I did stop before I reached the very bottom. Because I still had some of my lip showing through next to the teeth, I just used pink to fill that in. And then I decided that the eyelashes that I'd painted in previously were just not doing it, so I went back in and I made them much bigger. And then finally, I used white to paint in a few feathery whiskers each side and also to add a little shine on his nose. For the finishing touch, I decided that my bunny did really need to have a carrot, so I painted one of my fingers bright orange. I painted in some greenery running down the back of my hand, and then I used a brown to add a bit more detail to the carrot. And then finally, I added a bit more shading with some darker green, and I finished it off with a few highlights in white.